Hello, everybody. So, the quote of the week is this: Fascism does not ask for your consent, it only asks for your silence. And I think that this is very telling because of the times that we live in. And let me tell you clearly, America has become a fascist regime. And there's no denying it. And today, I want to explain what fascism really is because I actually see a lot of people who throw that term around without really understanding it, its history, and they don't really grasp the true meaning of the word. And ironically, I think that if people actually understood it more, they could actually apply this term even more liberally because we are a nation of fascist institutions. So, our history starts in Rome with the fasces. So the fasces was a bundle of wood with an axe, and it represented power and authority and unity. And basically, more importantly, it represented the power of a ruler or king or even an emperor to apply violence or punitive. So the axe symbolized the power to behead. And this symbol was what came to be the inspiring symbol of the fascists because a lot of fascists are traditionalists and they try to, specifically with Mussolini, apply their history back to Rome. But I'll get a little bit more in that later. So we have this bundle of rods, but how did that come to symbolize one of the most brutal ideologies in the world? Well, first off, we also need to understand that this bundle of rods, much like the Constitution or the American flag, it's a symbol. And fascists love symbols. And what's really funny is the symbol of the fasces, ironically, can be seen a lot in our American architecture. For example, with Abraham Lincoln sitting down on his chair, he's actually not sitting down on pillars, but he's standing on fasces. And the reason is also because the fasces symbolizes revolution. And that's why our founding fathers really incorporate, they by the way loved symbols, our founding fathers, but they incorporated symbolism throughout the architecture of America. And that can also be seen within the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, because the fasces is a revolutionary symbol. And that's really important to understand because the fascists, they are both revolutionary and reactionary. And it's important to understand the history of this term as a revolutionary term, a punitive term, but also a unifying symbol. But really, the main real history of fascism starts with one man, and his name is Benito Mussolini, otherwise known as Il Duce, which means the leader. And Mussolini really liked Roman symbolism. And that's why I say that fascism really strives with symbolism. So, the idea of fascism establishes itself in the 1920s as a reaction to the wave of socialism and communism. And I think that a main reason why people have an issue defining fascism is kind of an overlapping grouping of many different symptoms. And fascism is kind of a sickness that you use to define a lot of overarching symptoms. And altogether, they form fascism. Like, for example, a lot of people will tell me, was Stalin a fascist? Not necessarily, but also he kind of was in a sense, just not economically speaking. But I'm going down a rabbit hole. So, the main issue with fascism, and the reason why it's so hard to define, is fascism is a movement that defined an ideology, compared to, for example, democracy, which is an ideology that spurred in different movements. And one thing, the main trait that I would say with fascism is capitalism gone overboard. And that's why fascists, they hate communists, they hate capitalists, they hate progressives, and they use communism as an overarching term for anybody that stands against their rule. And basically, with Mussolini and his black shirts revolts, they both revolted against the state, but they were a reaction to socialism. And that's really important to understand, that they're both revolutionary and reactionary, because that's why they're so hard to define. And I think that the best way to define it is power. Now, back to socialism, because a lot of conservatives will tell me that Nazis were socialists. They're like, Sebastian, Nazis were socialists. They were named the National Socialist Party. How are they therefore extreme capitalists? And that's another reason, because fascism is also conservatism gone overboard. And conservatism don't want to be associated with fascism, so they try to blame it on the other side. They try to blame it as socialism. But really, an important thing to understand is that, yes, Hitler's party, the Nazis in Germany, the Nazis founded themselves from the National Socialist Party, but they were not socialists. And actually, it's kind of a misnomer, where they named themselves socialists to be able to attract the working class, who happened to be much more angry after World War I, much less educated and much more about action. And they would pool in all these very fed up type of groups while calling themselves socialists because it was what was common, but really they were preaching capitalist ideals. And for anybody who argues still that the Nazis were socialists, please pick up a book, because after World War I, Hitler was actually an informant for the government, spying on communist groups. And basically, that's how he got in touch with the Nazi Party, because he was informing on these small groups of communists. And then he found the Nazi Party, the National Socialist Party, and then it rose up. But as I've said before, the reason why fascism is so hard to describe is because it is an ideology that is formed from a movement, compared to if we take democracy. Democracy first starts with an ideology, and then the movements occur. So first, democracy, for example, I'm just taking that as an example. First, it defines itself as an ideology, and then there are movements who try to push on the agenda of democracy. While fascism, first there are movements who are angry and all that, and then they brand themselves as fascists. And that's why it's so hard, because there's so many different strands of fascism. There's, for example, Nazism, there's Mussolini, there's Franco, and there was even fascism, or kind of fascism, in Japan, for example. But we can argue that upon the strict definition of fascism, fascism needs to include ultra-capitalism, ultra-nationalism branded as patriotism, ultra-conservatism, so that means going back to traditional radical values, right? So for Mussolini, it was going back to Rome. And for Hitler, it was going back to some proto-Germanic societies, his whole ideal of all German Aryans. That was his ideal, so traditionalism in that sense. An opposition to democracy, and an opposition to liberalism. And I think that when we say liberalism, we need to define liberalism. So the definition of liberalism is that liberalism, basically, it preaches the liberty of the individual, while in fascism, there's actually a lack of identity. In that lack of identity, it's like their identity is their brand. So with fascism, for example, Hitler had all of his soldiers dressed very neatly. Mussolini, there were the black shirts. In fascism, it's almost ultra unity to the point where the individual is suffocated out. And another reason why is this unity. They use this unity as well to dehumanize their opponents. For example, the Nazis, when, for example, with the Jews, they would all group them together, and they even use a language as a way to group people together. So instead of calling Jews Jews, they would call them the Jew. So it's a type of typification and unification, ultra unification to the point where there is no individual, and that's really important to understand in fascism. And another main trait of fascism is, for the most part, a lot of the fascist rulers are never democratically elected. They're actually appointed. But that isn't like an official rule. But that's one of the key traits I'd say between an elected fascist and a dictator fascist. And that's something we'll go over. But a main question is, what do fascists want? What is their end goal? Well, as someone best put it, basically, fascism is the OCD of political ideologies. It seeks to control, it seeks to put in boxes, it puts its opponents in boxes, it controls language, it uses propaganda, it's ultra control. And there's an issue with that because fascism is order pushed in a sense of too much. But the issue with order is, if you have order is a reaction to chaos. But the issue is, when fascists get their way, they get order. But to elicit fear, you need chaos. So therefore, they need to break their own system. So fascists need to create their own chaos. And that's another trait of fascists, is they use violence as chaos. And this violence, they rebrand it as fear, and they blame it on their political opponents, while they are responsible for the violence themselves. So a main issue in America that we could basically make a parallel to would be saying that our cities are under attack, that there's insurrections happening in Portland, when in reality, Portland is just full of hipsters, baristas, chill people, honestly cool people. But they harness this fear, right? And they elicit violence, and then they said, the fascists will say, we had to employ violence because it was under attack. Well, they themselves are what's causing the issue. They cause the impoverishments. They cause a lack of health care, for which people are inevitably unhappy. So fascism is both institutional and physical, with violence. And violence is really that main trait of fascism, right? So it's kind of like a fire with its fuel always running out. And basically, to sum it up, authoritarianism, nationalism, a hierarchy, an elitism, and militarism. That's basically fascism and the symptoms of fascism in the most clear sense. And it's all about power. The end goal is about power. It's not about, unlike communists, having a different stratification of society, so having different ways of organizing society. It's all about power. So, as someone best put it, fascists want to create a powerful, unified, and expansionist nation ruled by a single, all-powerful leader. Their core goals are to restore national prestige, suppress all opposition, and place the interests of the state above those of the individual. And with this being said, I think it's very apt that, now that we've defined fascism, how is America fascist? So now I want to explain how America is fascist in theory. There'll be another video where I'll actually explain how similar is the laws of America compared to Nazi Germany. And boy, it's similar. But anyways, ideologically, there is no doubt that Trump is a fascist. Trump is an authoritarian. And people have told me repetitively that I'm wrong calling Trump an authoritarian because there's still individual rule. And to that I'll say that the people are being very mistaken with totalitarianism. And there's a big difference. So totalitarianism means total control. Authoritarianism means authoritative control. So the main difference is just the degree of control that the government has. So authoritarianism just means that there's still some control of the individual, and totalitarianism means that there's no control. And for the most part, fascism starts with authoritarianism and then evolves into totalitarianism. So sure, Trump at this stage is not a totalitarian, he's an authoritarian, but I predict that he will evolve into an authoritarian. So basically, both ideologies of authoritarianism and totalitarianism involve the government demanding the submission of a nation's citizens to a strong central authority. And it means control over the people, while authoritarianism is not necessarily democratic, but it's just less of a degree. So here is the list of ideologically how Trump compares to fascism. So remember, fascism is ultranationalist. Check. So a main trend of fascism is party nationalism. For example, in Nazi Germany, Hitler didn't use the flags of Germany or the flags of Prussia. He used the flags of his own Nazi party. It was the party that was in control, not the nation that was expanding, but the party. And we can clearly see this with MAGA, who are riding over the American flag. And by the way, that's just unpatriotic. The American flag should remain the American flag. And MAGA is unpatriotic for putting their own flag over the American flag. Furthermore, most MAGA that I see are more apt to wear MAGA flags or MAGA merch and MAGA symbolism than American patriotic symbolism. Democrats at this stage are clearly more patriotic, more truly patriotic than MAGA. MAGA has only in-party patriotism. So in that sense, yes, ultranationalism, and they've rebranded what nationalism means. We do live, secondly, in an ultra-capitalist system. And in the ultra-capitalist system, the government tries to basically, it's no longer a free market. And this can be seen with Trump partnering with, basically the government kind of takes control with the market. And this can be very confusing because some people have actually compared Trump to being communist. And the way that I would say is this. In Stalinism, so when Stalin ruled, the lower class was communist, while the elites were capitalist. While in fascism, I would say the lower class lives in an unfree capitalist market where they're forced to compete but can never really enter the market because the market has become oversaturated with monopolies. While the elites are socializing industries such as Trump with Bitcoin and Trump partnering with his own military complexes and multiple AI big tech corporations such as Palantir working with the government. So the government works with the corporations at an elite level. So that's kind of the difference between, I'd say, Stalinism and fascism. But it can be confusing. And still, some scholars will disagree. So next, we have hyper-militaristic society. We can clearly see this with Trump doing militaristic parades, Trump meeting with all the generals in one area. And by the way, the generals weren't too happy from what I saw. And more importantly, a privatized police. Every fascist individual who is a ruler has their own private police. Mussolini had basically privatized a small amount of the black shirts into a highly organized militia. I'm going to say that Stalin was a fascist, but economically from the left. And as we can clearly see with Stalin, he had the KGB. Hitler had the SS, and Trump has ICE. So, privatized police. Violence. That's number 6 on my list. So with violence, we have tons of violence. We have violence with racialized rhetoric. We have poverty as a form of violence. And we have violence all around being rebranded from the different political party and being blamed on different political parties. We have ICE. We have the ICE raids. So violence is a big defining factor of fascism, right? Next up, we have race theory. And at first, Trump, during his first term, he was taking the fight against Muslims. He even was taking the fight against African Americans. Now he's taking the fights against immigrants. And that has sort of done an umbrella overarching effect. And by the way, I'll do a video on this later. But you can clearly see the same words per verbatim used by Donald Trump and per Hitler. The same exact words to describe that were used to describe Jews that Hitler used are being now used to describe immigrants and Mexicans. So we have this racial ideology. And that's very important because I'll explain this later. It kind of ties into this idea that fascists have where they call anything different degeneracy. Next on my list is a lack of democracy. Fascists do not like democracy because it's anti-authoritarian. It's not powerful. It doesn't push their agenda of power. So Trump has regularly bypassed the Supreme Court. He has broken laws, and he's even violated the Constitution and the democratic processes. So check on all of that. And lastly, before last, we have the idea of degeneracy. And it's very funny because I was told this the other week. I was talking about how America had become fascism, and somebody told me that wokeism caused fascism. And I was just like, buddy, pick up a book, go outside, touch some grass, buddy. I think you need to talk to some people and get out of your room because wokeism did not cause fascism. Seriously, some people. Wokeism actually means to be awakened. That's all it means. And it has become a movement of diversity. In fascism, leaders call diversity degeneracy. One of the first institutional forms of eugenics was when Hitler actually used his medical team to kill people with disabilities. And I forget the number, but it was a huge amount. And in our system, as we've seen with RFK Jr., there has been an attack against people with disabilities. And there's an attack against universities. Hitler did not like universities because he saw that as a breeding ground for his so-called degeneracy. And basically, in fascism, degeneracy is anything that's not up to the agenda of fascists. And diversity is liberalism, or freedom. And remember, the fascists do not like liberalism and freedom because power cannot coexist with freedom. So they try to destroy this diversity. And they paint self-expression as a villainous form of expression. And all that is to put in place their traditional values. And that can even seen as in Trump's and Charlie Kirk's posters, the late Charlie Kirk, when he, on his posters, he would brand himself as combating wokeness and protecting the West, whatever that means. I don't know who he's protecting the West from. That was pretty dumb. Basically, no free thought. Thought leads to diversity. Diversity leads to freedom. Freedom is a form of self-expression, and self-expression is a form of liberalism. Hence, fascists do not like liberalism. And lastly, I would say a very important trait is the coexistence with religion. Religion is not inherently fascist. Yet fascism is a religion of the state. Fascism uses other existing religions, such as Hitler, who actually referenced God multiple times in his speeches. And who would call, actually, this is so funny, he would say that Jesus, who, let's face it, Jesus was a Jew, he would call Jesus an Aryan. And he said that Jesus was an Aryan who was betrayed by the Jews. So he rebranded religion. And the religion worked with him in some instances. Mussolini even worked closely with the Catholic Church, and the church even worked closely with Franco in Spain. And so Trump has been using religion, and more importantly, it's been born again religion, born again Baptist, evangelical Christianism, as a way to promote ultranationalism, whiteness, and to paint himself as a God given ruler. And what I think is very funny is he's been using that religion to work very closely with another dictator, and that's Netanyahu. And in fascism, authoritarians work closely together. And that's to say, Netanyahu, who is the leader of Israel, is not a Nazi because he's not anti-Jewish. But he is more than definitely a fascist. So a good way to remember is this. Not all fascists are Nazis, but all Nazis are fascists. I would not call Trump a Nazi, because Nazism is really branded with that idea of anti-Semitism. And in America, we have something a little bit different, but it still is fascism. So MAGA has used religion, basically, to fuse political beliefs and Christian beliefs into the ideal to promote a religious nation state. So Trump's fascism has merged with religion to become a statewide fascist religion state. And I would say, some people would say that we live in a bureaucratic state. Others would say that we live in a police state. I would say that Trump has been pushing the agenda of a fascist theocracy, of a fascist state policing theocracy. And I think there's a point to that. And I just want to say that this is very ironic because there has already been a Nazi movement early in America. It was in the 1940s, 1930s, around that time. There were Nazis in America who even had summer camps meant to indoctrinate children. And the Nazis, even in New York Madison Square, had an event with more than 20,000 Nazis in Madison Square. So all of this basically to say, and to sum it up, Trump is more than definitely a fascist. By definitional terms, we cannot call him a Nazi, but we can call him a fascist. We cannot call him a totalitarian, but we can call him an authoritarian. Is Trump a dictator? I would say, as of now, there's not yet enough information to prove that Trump was not elected democratically. But if Trump were to run for another term, and while he is running, 100%, I would say then that he is a dictator. All of this to say, eventually, I think America, if we do not act, will fall into full-on totalitarianism. There is one good thing. Fascism means hate, and hate can only sustain itself for so long before succumbing to something else. And whatever Trump is doing, it's not going to be self-sustainable. And that's why we need to fight it.